All right. So today looks like we're diving into religion and reform in the early 1800s.
Yeah.
We've got this big stack of material here, and a lot of it's drawn from the American Yawp, which is a great source for this period.
Mm.
Um, I'm already kind of getting like pre-Civil War tension vibes from just glancing through this material.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Would you say that that's kind of the overarching theme here?
Yeah, this era in U.S. history was a time of a lot of change. You
Right. Yeah.
had the Industrial Revolution booming, you had cities growing westward expansion,
Yeah.
all these social shifts happening, and people were really searching for something to kind of hold on to.
hmm
And for a lot of people, that was religion.
Yeah, it wasn't just about like, going to church on Sunday, right?
Right.
It seems like this religious fervor was really like a catalyst for some major social movements.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it wasn't a gradual shift either. It was like this spiritual earthquake.
Mm-hmm.
It was called the Second Great Awakening,
Mm-hmm.
and it really just swept through the nation.
So what was that like? I mean, did people just start going to church more or?
No, it was way more dramatic than that.
Okay.
Instead of like these quiet contemplative services,
Hmm.
you had these massive outdoor revivals
Wow.
with these really passionate preachers. People were
Mm.
shouting, they were jumping, they were even fainting from the intensity of it all.
Wow. Okay, so I'm picturing like a scene straight out of a movie now.
Yeah.
Um, so how did the established churches react to this? Like,
Well, think of it like a spiritual chain reaction.
okay,
You had all these new denominations like the Methodists and the Baptists exploding in popularity,
right.
and they were sending out these circuit riders.
The writer.
Yeah, these traveling preachers who were kind of like the rock stars of the day,
Oh, wow.
going all over, spreading the word, especially to the frontier.
So it's not just the what of their message that's changing, it's the how, too.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like they cracked the code on making religion go viral.
hmm
But what about the message itself? Was that changing too?
Yeah, that's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, yeah.
They kind of flipped the script on these traditional ideas of predestination and salvation.
Oh, how so?
Well, before it was all about your fate being sealed, like
Yeah.
you were either saved or you were damned.
Mm.
But now it's all about personal choice, having the power to shape your own spiritual path.
So that must have been like really appealing to people at a time when everything else around them felt chaotic and uncertain.
Yeah, absolutely. This idea of personal agency
Right.
really resonated with people.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't just confined to the spiritual realm either.
Okay.
It spilled over into this desire to reshape the world around them, to make things better, to fix society's problems.
So not just saving souls, but saving society too.
Exactly.
So I'm seeing this term benevolent empire pop up a lot in these materials.
Right.
Can you explain what that's all about?
Yeah, so basically think of it like this network of organizations
Okay.
led mainly by these middle-class evangelicals who felt that they had this moral duty to address society's ills.
Mm-hmm.
They were tackling everything, from temperance
Okay.
to prison reform to education,
Hmm.
even the treatment of the mentally ill.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it is.
And there were some really remarkable figures involved, like Dorothea Dix.
Oh, right, Dorothea Dix.
Yeah, she was just this tireless advocate for humane treatment of the mentally ill.
It's striking how they were so driven to tackle these huge societal problems.
Right. It really was this sense of moral urgency.
Yeah.
And, we often think of reform as being like this secular thing.
Right.
But here, it's deeply rooted in this religious awakening.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah, and it wasn't just about reinforcing existing beliefs either.
Okay.
The Second Great Awakening also led to the emergence of all these new religious movements.
Like what?
Well, like, take Joseph Smith and the founding of Mormonism.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, talk about a group that really pushed boundaries.
Right.
They faced so much suspicion and persecution. They ended up having to flee.
Yes.
They headed west and eventually settled in Utah.
Wow. It's like they were forced to create their own space to actually live out their beliefs.
Exactly.
It's really fascinating.
Yeah, and the Mormons weren't alone.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. This era saw all sorts of groups experimenting with these really radical social norms.
Yeah.
Well, you had the Shakers who embraced celibacy,
Okay.
and then you had the Oneida community
Right.
with their practice of free love.
It was a wild time of religious and social experimentation.
It really was.
It sounds like they were challenging not only religious orthodoxy, but also the very fabric of American society.
Oh, absolutely.
Hmm.
And what's really fascinating is that these movements didn't just stay isolated within the U.S.
Oh, really?
They were actually part of this transatlantic exchange of ideas and strategies.
So reformers on both sides of the Atlantic were kind of realizing that they weren't alone in these struggles.
Exactly. They were grappling with a lot of the same problems, you
Yeah.
know? And with improvements in transportation and communication,
Mm,
like steamboats and cheaper printing,
right.
they could actually share publications and build these global networks.
So reformers were really starting to connect on this international
Yeah.
level. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I'm guessing that the abolitionist movement
Yes.
is a great example of this.
Absolutely. It was deeply intertwined with similar movements in Great Britain.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, these reformers weren't just trying to change America. They were part of a global movement.
That shared purpose must have been incredibly empowering,
Oh, definitely.
to know that others across the ocean were facing these similar challenges and fighting for similar causes.
Absolutely.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and another great example of this is the fight against alcohol consumption,
Right.
which became known as the Temperance Crusade.
The Temperance Crusade.
Okay. Yeah, and you can think of it as like the 19th century version of Just Say No. It was really fueled by this belief that excessive drinking was destroying families and undermining morality.
And their tactics were pretty intense too, right?
Oh, yeah, they weren't afraid to use some pretty dramatic imagery.
Like what?
Well, remember those Tree of Intemperance lithographs?
Oh, right.
Yeah, it's this really striking image of a diseased tree
Okay.
meant to represent the destructive impact of alcohol.
Wow, that's a powerful visual. I'm sure that was hard to ignore, especially for people who might be struggling with alcohol abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. It would really hit home.
So it was about highlighting both the dangers and the possibilities.
Rexac.
That's a really effective strategy.
Yeah, they were appealing to both fear and aspiration,
Right.
trying to drive social change on multiple fronts.
Did they face any pushback, though?
Oh, of course, not everyone was on board with their message.
Right,
And as we talked about earlier, there was definitely a class dimension to this.
right.
For a lot of working class people,
Mm.
drinking was a really ingrained part of their culture and their social life.
Yeah.
So you had this clash of values playing out,
Right.
which just highlights the fact that these movements, while well-intentioned, weren't always perfect.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history is messy. And that even those striving for positive change can sometimes overlook the nuances of different lived experiences.
Absolutely.
It's a really important point to keep in mind,
Yeah,
especially as we continue to explore these movements in more depth.
right.
And I think it's time now to tackle the big one,
Yeah,
the fight to end slavery, abolitionism.
right.
And for many religious reformers,
Mm.
this was like the ultimate sin, like a stain on the nation's soul.
Absolutely. Slavery was seen as this moral abomination.
And it's amazing how central morality was to their entire worldview.
Right. It wasn't just about politics for them.
Right.
It was this deeply spiritual imperative to fight for justice and equality.
And that moral fervor wasn't just about temperance and abolition, was it?
Right. It extended to other reform efforts too, like
Like prison reform, for example.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of fascinating how institutions like Eastern State Penitentiary, which we tend to associate with punishment, were actually born out of this desire for rehabilitation.
so instead of just locking people up and throwing away the key,
Yeah.
they were actually trying to design systems that could reform individuals
Exactly.
and give them like a second chance.
That was the idea.
It's pretty progressive for the time.
It was. And what's really remarkable is that Eastern State Penitentiary, with its innovative panopticon design,
The panopticon?
yeah, this idea of constant surveillance,
Right.
it actually became a model for prisons around the world.
Wow. So they were influencing like
Mhm.
prison design globally.
Yeah, another example of how these American reform movements were having this global impact.
It speaks to their ambition.
Absolutely.
They weren't just trying to fix things locally. They were aiming for like systemic change on an international scale.
Yeah, they had this really broad vision.
It's pretty amazing.
It is.
But before we move on from temperance, I'm curious about something.
Okay.
We talked about their use of imagery, like with the Tree of Intemperance.
Right.
But what were some of their other tactics? Like, how did they actually go about trying to change people's behavior?
Well, one of their key strategies was to really drive home the negative consequences of alcohol abuse.
Okay.
And they did this in a very deliberate and often dramatic way. Like, remember that Drunkard's Progress series of Prince?
Oh, yeah.
It was like this cautionary tale
Yeah.
depicting the downward spiral of an individual consumed by alcohol,
Right.
ultimately ending in poverty and despair.
So they were tapping into like the anxieties of the time.
Yeah.
playing on people's fears of social decline and moral decay.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And it wasn't just about staring people either.
Okay.
They also tried to present a compelling alternative.
Okay.
They promoted the idea of a sober life as a path to happiness, prosperity, respectability.
Okay.
They wanted to convince people that giving up alcohol wasn't about deprivation. It was about embracing a better way of life.
So it's like a two-pronged approach.
Exactly.
Highlight the negative consequences, but also emphasize the positive benefits.
Mm-hmm.
Did they face any pushback, though?
Oh, of course.
Like what?
Well, not everyone embraced their message.
Right.
And as we discussed earlier, there was this class element to it.
Yeah.
For many working class people, drinking was such an ingrained part of their social life and culture.
Right.
So you had this tension between middle class reformers and those who felt like their way of life was being targeted.
It's a reminder that these movements, while often driven by noble intentions, could also be kind of blind to the complexities of class and culture.
Yeah, definitely.
And it seems like a similar dynamic was playing out in the abolitionist movement,
Right.
particularly with the involvement of women.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about how some, like the Grimke sisters,
Right.
faced a lot of criticism for speaking out against slavery. Can we unpack that a bit more?
Sure. So it's important to remember that during this era, the prevailing view was that women belonged in the domestic sphere.
Right.
Public speaking, especially on controversial topics like slavery, was seen as highly inappropriate for women.
So when women like the Grimke sisters,
Right.
who were from a slaveholding family in South Carolina, no less,
Exactly.
started speaking out against slavery, it was a huge deal.
It was.
They were challenging not only the institution of slavery, but also the deeply ingrained norms about women's place in society.
Right. They were breaking social taboos.
Stepping outside of their prescribed role.
Yeah, and making themselves targets of criticism in the process.
And it wasn't just like gentle disapproval, right?
Oh, no, it was much harsher than that.
Okay.
They were publicly ridiculed, accused of being unfeminine, of neglecting their domestic duties,
Wow.
even of trying to usurp men's authority.
But despite the backlash, they persisted.
They did. And their courage really helped pave the way for future generations of women to speak out and fight for their rights.
Yet their involvement in the abolitionist movement almost seems like a training ground for the women's rights movement that would follow.
It's a really interesting connection.
Right.
The experience of fighting for the rights of others, particularly enslaved people, seems to have awakened this sense of their own disenfranchisement.
Like they realized that the fight for freedom and equality wasn't just about one group.
Right.
It was about challenging systems of oppression wherever they existed.
Exactly.
And that brings to mind another key point.
Mm-hmm.
The crucial role played by Black activists in the abolitionist movement.
Yeah, absolutely.
It wasn't just white people advocating for Black liberation.
Right.
It was Black people themselves leading the charge.
Absolutely. And no figure embodies that leadership more than Frederick Douglass.
Frederick Douglass, right?
I mean, his story is just incredible.
Yeah.
He escaped from slavery, taught himself to read and write,
Wow.
became this brilliant orator and writer, and dedicated his life to fighting for the freedom and equality of his people.
His autobiography is such a powerful testament to the horrors of slavery and the indomitable spirit of those who resisted it.
It really is.
And it wasn't just his writing.
Right.
He was a tireless organizer.
Yeah.
Traveling across the country and even to Europe, speaking out against slavery, rallying support for the cause.
Yeah, he was really instrumental in building this international abolitionist movement.
And he understood the power of connecting with people on a human level, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Sharing his own experiences, forcing them to confront the brutal reality of slavery.
Yeah, he was a master of using his personal story to really drive home the message.
And it wasn't just Douglass.
Right.
There were so many other Black activists,
Yeah.
men and women, working on the ground, organizing communities, publishing newspapers, aiding runaway slaves.
Absolutely. They were the backbone of the movement.
Really risking their lives for the cause.
Yeah, they were on the front lines, facing the most direct and brutal consequences of the system they were trying to dismantle.
It's a side of the story that often gets overshadowed by the narratives of white abolitionists.
It's true, and it's so important to remember that the abolitionist movement wasn't just some white savior narrative.
Right.
It was a Black-led movement fueled by the courage, resilience, and determination of those who had experienced the horrors of slavery firsthand.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about temperance abolition and women's rights.
Right.
But it's striking how these were just a few of the many reform movements sweeping through America during this period.
Oh, yeah. It seemed like there was a movement for almost every imaginable cause.
Yeah, like what else was going on?
Well, you had movements for prison reform,
Okay.
education reform, mental health reform.
Wow.
It was really a testament to the era's idealism and belief in the power of social change.
It almost seems like a period of like social awakening,
Yeah.
like this recognition that things could be better and this willingness to actively work towards that better future.
Right.
Was there like a common thread running through all these movements, though?
I think the common thread was this deep-seated belief in the possibility of progress,
Okay.
fueled in large part by the religious fervor of the Second Great Awakening.
So it wasn't just about personal salvation.
Oh.
It was about creating a more just and righteous society.
Exactly.
And that manifested in so many different ways.
Yeah.
You had missionary societies spreading the gospel, Bible societies distributing scriptures, tract societies publishing religious pamphlets, Sunday schools providing religious education to children.
Right. It was this multifaceted effort to bring about a moral and spiritual transformation of society.
And while not all of these efforts were successful,
Of course.
they reflected this really powerful impulse to make the world a better place.
Yeah, they were willing to experiment, to challenge the status quo, and to push for change on multiple fronts.
But it's important to acknowledge that these movements weren't without their flaws.
Right.
As we've discussed, some were exclusive, others were paternalistic, and still others had unintended consequences.
Yeah, it's a good reminder that history is complex. And that even those striving for positive change can sometimes make mistakes or perpetuate harmful ideas.
We need to be able to look at these movements with a critical eye, recognizing both their achievements and their shortcomings.
Absolutely.
And it's also essential to remember that even those movements that didn't fully achieve their goals
Right.
still played a crucial role in shaping the national conversation
Yeah.
and paving the way for future progress.
They helped to shift public opinion, raise awareness, and plant seeds that would eventually bear fruit.
It's remarkable to consider the sheer scale of their ambition.
It is.
They weren't just tinkering around the edges.
Yeah.
They were aiming for like a fundamental transformation of American society.
Exactly.
It's really inspiring.
It is. And you know what's so inspiring about these reformers is that they didn't let setbacks or criticism deter them. They were driven by this deep sense of purpose and this conviction that they were on the right side of history.
And their stories remind us that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles, even when progress feels slow or non-existent,
Yeah,
it's important to keep pushing, to keep fighting for the world we want to see.
absolutely.
Because as these reformers demonstrated, change is possible.
It is.
And even small acts of courage and compassion can have a ripple effect, creating waves of change that can transform society for the better.
So well said.
Yeah, it's really powerful.
It is. Their legacy continues to inspire us, reminding us that we all have the power to make a difference.
But now it's time for us to kind of step back and reflect on everything we've learned and to consider the broader implications of this era of religious fervor and social reform.
Okay, I'm ready.
Wow. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, exploring this world of religion and reform in antebellum America. It's almost dizzying to think about all that was happening in such a short period of time. What stands out to you as the most significant legacy of this era?
You know, I think it's the sheer audacity of their vision. These reformers, they weren't content with just tweaking the system, you know? They were aiming for a complete overhaul of American society, driven by this conviction that things could be radically different and better.
Yeah, and they didn't shy away from tackling these deeply ingrained social ills.
Right.
Whether it was slavery, alcohol abuse, the lack of rights for women.
Exactly.
And they didn't just talk about it either.
No.
They put in the work. They organized, they protested,
Yeah.
they lobbied, they published, they risked their reputations, and sometimes even their lives for the causes they believed in. It's a powerful reminder that change requires action, not just good intentions.
Absolutely. They understood that changing hearts and minds was essential,
Right.
but it wasn't enough.
Right.
They needed to change laws, institutions, societal norms to
Right.
truly make a lasting impact.
And that often meant pushing boundaries,
Yeah.
challenging those in power, facing fierce opposition.
Exactly.
Speaking of pushing boundaries, I keep coming back to the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848.
Oh, yeah.
It's incredible to think that this group of women,
Right.
largely inspired by their experiences in the abolitionist movement, came together to formally demand equal rights, including the right to vote.
It was a landmark event.
It was. It seems like such a pivotal moment in the long struggle for women's equality.
It really was. It's a testament to the power of ideas and the interconnectedness of social movements, you know?
Right.
Those women at Seneca Falls drew inspiration from the abolitionist movement.
Right.
They recognized the parallels between their own disenfranchisement and the plight of enslaved people.
Yeah.
They understood that the fight for freedom and equality was a universal one, cutting across race, gender, and other social divisions.
And while they didn't achieve full equality overnight,
Right.
their declaration of Seneca Falls helped spark a movement that would continue for decades,
Yeah,
eventually leading to women winning the right to vote in 1920.
it's amazing.
It is. It's a reminder that social change is often a long and arduous process, but that even small steps can have a profound impact over time.
Absolutely.
And, it's also worth highlighting that many of these reformers were deeply religious.
Right.
They saw their activism as an expression of their faith, a way to live out their Christian values and work towards the kind of world they believed God intended.
It's a really interesting dimension to consider.
It is. It makes you wonder how the landscape of social reform might look different today if more people saw their activism as an extension of their faith,
Yeah.
or at least their deeply held values. Could it be a source of greater motivation and commitment to social change?
That's a fascinating question. It certainly highlights the potential for faith-based activism to be a powerful force for good in the world.
Right.
But it also raises questions about inclusivity
Right.
and the need to ensure that such movements are welcoming to people of all faiths and those who don't identify with any particular religion.
Right.
Ultimately, effective social change requires building bridges across difference, not reinforcing divisions.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into religion and reform in antebellum America, I'm left with a sense of both awe and caution. Awe at the sheer energy, idealism, and commitment of these reformers,
Right.
but also caution in recognizing that even well-intentioned movements can have unintended consequences, and that the work of creating a more just and equitable society is never truly finished.
It's an ongoing process.
It is. It requires constant vigilance, self-reflection, and a willingness to learn from the past as we strive to build a better future.
Well said. We can draw inspiration from the reformers of this era,
Yeah.
learning from their successes and their mistakes as we confront the challenges of our own time.
Absolutely.
Their legacy reminds us that we all have a role to play in shaping the world we want to live in.
Right.
Whether it's speaking out against injustice, volunteering our time, donating to causes we care about,
Yeah.
or simply having difficult conversations with those who hold different views.
Right.
Each of us can contribute to creating a more just and compassionate world.
That's a great point. Thank you for joining us on this journey through a truly transformative period in American history.
It was my pleasure.
And thank you for sharing your insights and expertise. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep striving to make a difference.